please, will you give a very warm Music Matters welcome to Ralph Simon and Mr. Steve Lillywhite.
Unos, dos, tres, 14.
Unos, dos, tres,
I love that riff.
14. Yes, that's a good riff, isn't it?
Unos, dos,
Are there
tres,
people
14.
14. Are there still people here?
Yes, they are.
My God, what the fuck are you doing here? Thank you for staying for so long.
Steve, this is such a treat to
Ralph,
have
it's been wonderful.
having you at Music Matters.
Yes.
And to be able to have someone who really believes in creating musical art.
Yeah, for
It's
me,
really
it's
something.
always been, art has always been the basis of my being, really. And timeless art is something we all try and aim for. And we all appreciate timeless art, whether it's the Chrysler Building, the Concorde, or Rumours by Fleetwood Mac. And sometimes, you know, it's very difficult to create timeless art, but if you don't try for it, you'll never achieve it.
So, essentially, your role as a producer, you view as finding art, taking that art, shaping it so that you make it even more artful and having a real soul and spirit and texture and
hopefully my sense of taste, if I've got one, is one that will, you know, will translate to the people. And I'm very, very lucky. You know, I think I can find good artists to work with, and I have a good sense of what is good at the early stages, which can help.
Well, let's go to the early stages and let's just
Many
see how it
years
all
ago.
started.
Yes.
Many years ago, but the interesting thing is, you left school at 16.
I think I did. And
You were not
well,
good at school.
I wasn't expelled, but they did call me in and they said, "Steve, do you really want to be here?" And I went, "I don't think so." And they said, "No, we don't think so either."
At
so,
16?
At 16, yes. So I didn't go to university. I didn't have any really good education and I didn't really do much before that. And so it was a little bit bad, but I was very lucky. I got a job in a recording studio straight away.
So in those days in a recording studio, the setup was different to today's Pro Tools environment.
Oh my God, it was...
Because what you'd have is you'd have a big desk.
Yep.
You'd have a producer, an engineer, and one or two, maybe three tape operators.
Right, and I was a tape operator stroke T-boy.
So did you make more tea or more tapes?
There was one, probably more tea, and especially once. Everyone makes one mistake, right?
Right.
Because if you make two mistakes, you're not here on stage talking to people, you know. But my one big mistake, there I was pressing my buttons, and it was a big orchestral session. It was a big union job and like a 30-piece orchestra. And if you take your last between 10 and 1 p.m., right, 10 in the morning to 1 p.m., if you start the last take 2 minutes to 1, you're allowed to go over the hour, right? But if you start on one, you know, you go into overtime. Anyway, 2 minutes to 1, frantic, we need to record this last one. My job is to press play and record. So I do that, 2 minutes to 1, at 3 minutes past 1, the track is finished and the producer says, "Tea, please." I go and get the tea, bring it back, and he says, "Let's hear that last take." I go and I press play, and there is nothing. And it's like, the producer then presses the button, "Hang on, guys," by which point the violin players had all fucked off because they just put their violin and go. Everyone's packing up. Oh. And the studio had to pay the overtime. And my boss, who was very gracious, he gave me that one chance. And all I had to do was to press 2 buttons, and I only pressed 1. But I did learn from that.
But what happens if you're a tape operator in those days is you'd sit in the back of the control room.
Well, actually, I was sitting in a separate room. This was so weird. This was the last studio probably in the world that had a separate room where the tape operator sat. So I would sit in this room, and I didn't even see the guys pressing the faders and doing all that stuff. So I became a really great tape op. I mean, I was really fast.
But this also gave you an opportunity from the background, as it were, to observe producers at work, orchestras at work.
It didn't.
It didn't?
No, I met roadies. Roadies would come in and sit with me and go, "What the fuck are you doing?" I said, "I'm doing the buttons." And they went, "Oh yeah, there's no one in there." So it was the loneliness of the long distance runner. I was very, very long hours. So because I was in a separate room and I didn't know how the engineering worked, at weekends, my boss would allow us to go in and make demos to learn how to engineer, because I was very good with, I used my ears all the time, but I didn't know
How to work the
EQing or how to work the board. So, you know, in these days, a studio would provide both a tape op and an engineer. So I would go in and do these demos with a band I found, and from those demos, this band called Ultravox got a record deal.
So what you did was you basically did demos out of your normal working hours,
Yes,
in a sense.
that's right.
So you were doing music, recording 24/7,
Yep.
just basically a few hours of sleeping.
Yeah, and then going
And
in
one
at
of those
weekends,
demos
yeah.
was this band called Ultravox.
Ultravox,
With a
and-
Scottish lead, Midjure.
No, it was before that. It was with a singer called John Fox. It was like a Roxy Music type punk band. This was in 1977. They got critical acclaim, but they got signed to Island Records, which was my first contact with Chris Blackwell, who over the years I've had a great relationship with.
Chris Blackwell founded Island
Founded
Records,
Island
signed
Records,
Bob Marley, signed YouTube.
Yeah,
bunch
one
other
of the
people.
great guys.
Great record guy.
Great record man. But these demos and Island Records said, yeah, you can work with Steve, but you need to work with someone else, which, and the band wanted to work with Brian Eno from Roxy Music, who he had just left Roxy Music at this time. So that was the first time I met Brian Eno, who we might, and I didn't meet Brian Eno again for quite a few years until we were both working on the Joshua Tree by U2.
But then an interesting thing happens in England. There's a huge revolution in England.
Yes.
And it was a musical revolution where a whole new punk movement started, and you were at right time, right place to both observe it, to see
Yep.
the gigs, to...
I was there. I remember reading this thing that said I was ubiquitous, and I didn't really know what that meant. And then I looked it up in the dictionary. I thought, oh, that's not quite so good. But basically, I was at all the clubs all the time, seeing all the bands. And I've said this before, but you know, it was full of bands who couldn't play. What better than a producer who couldn't really produce? So that's how I got my foot in the door. And in fact, my roommate knew this man called Johnny Thunders, who was in a band called the New York Dolls, who were, you know, pretty seminal. And I did a solo record with this man. And from there, the manager of a band called Siouxsie and the Banshees came to the studio. He liked what he heard, and he said, Steve, can you do our first single? Now, this was at the height of punk, and I knew this band, Siouxsie and the Banshees, would have a hit if they had a good record. So I said, yes, I'd love to do this. And of course, I had a hit, and it's like Catch-22.
Can we just pull up a slide of the name of that hit there, please, Ed? We've got the slide on our monitor here, so that people can see that Steve had a linkage with Asia right from the start of that very first hit.
Hong Kong Garden, yes.
And so that was your first hit in 1970?
Number 7 in 1978, September 1978.
And Siouxsie and the Banshees at that time were real leaders in the whole punk
yeah,
movement.
them and the Sex Pistols. There was a famous time when the Sex Pistols swore on live television, and Bill Grundy lost
Bill
his
Grundy
job.
TV show, that's right.
And Siouxsie of Siouxsie and the Banshees was there. It was part of this thing called the Croydon scene or something. Anyway, but I did the single, did their first album, which was very successful, and I was off. You know, I had a hit, and I went, oh my God, I don't have to flip burgers. I can make records for a living.
So around that same period, with all of this stuff going on, the punk movement, where bands tended to play with energy rather necessarily than trying to emulate the Eric Claptons, the Eagles.
We hated the Eagles. We hate it. And now I used to make records, and I would not let the guitarist bend notes. I was, it was like I was dismissing everything Dave Gilmour had ever played.
Right.
You know, it's like ridiculous when I think of it now. But when you're young, you're opinionated, and that was good. But yeah, we so I made a series of punk records and had hits. But really, for me, punk rock was a great attitude. It was much more an attitude than it was an art form. As an art form, it was limited. So I was always looking at people. I didn't like the punk that was just scream, scream, scream. Bands like XTC and the Psychedelic Furs and the Members and all that. It was not quite like that. I always used to look at it as art. Even so I would, get some success, but try and move away from punk, because I didn't want to be known as the guy who did punk, and then all of a sudden punk is out of out of favor. Because for me, music has always just been good or bad. I don't look at genres.
So when you say good or bad, you mean good melody, good song construction, good musicianship?
Just doesn't have to be any of those. I just look at it as good or bad. If it moves me.
If it moves
You know,
you.
I don't know about, good musicianship is, it's important, but I would, some producers love to say to a band, I'll produce you if you fire the drummer. You see, that's not me. I would just not produce a band if I had to fire the drummer, because who am I to say that drummer should be fired? Someone else can produce you. There's lots of other people I could produce. The famous U2 story that when Paul McGuinness went in to Muff Winwood and he said, I'll sign your
Muff
band.
Winwood is a famous A&R guy, the brother of Stevie Winwood, the famous musician.
He was
and
an
Muff was the
A&R
head of A&R at Island Records.
No, Muff was the head of A&R at CBS Records,
formerly-
and he wanted to sign U2, and the U2's manager went in the office and he said, we'll sign your band, but you need to fire the drummer because he's no good. And Paul said, but the drummer, he formed the band. We can't fire the drummer, he formed U2. And so he passed on signing U2.
And that got them to go to Ireland. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. But in that, when you had the hit with Siouxsie and the Banshees,
Right.
you then got involved with what was then a really hot kind of punk band, the Psychedelic Furs.
Yeah.
And also that same period, you also then got to meet the Scottish band Simple Minds.
That was a bit later, but yes, I did well with Celts.
So just give us... Celts.
Name like Lillywhite, it's not very Celtic, but I don't know, for some reason I do well.
So just trying to get a progression.
Yeah.
As this punk movement started to develop, the Sex Pistols, Anarchy in the UK,
Yeah.
God Save the Queen, big hits.
Love it.
And really energy started to replace what used to have been seen as great musicality, but
Right.
there was an incredible spirit and energy going on.
But it was, it was, everyone has their time, and this was a sort of, it was a great spirit of music. And, but as I say, I didn't see it as the end. I saw it as a means to work with great people. So, I would work with, not just, the Simple Minds came later, and that was when I'd sort of changed my sound a bit to try and be more sort of make big music for the world.
Well, before we
big
get
rock
into the big
music.
thing, but that same year that you produced Psychedelic Furs was when you were introduced to U2 when they'd signed to Ireland.
I think so. Around about 1980, I think, is when.
Exactly.
And I remember the first time. The story goes is that there was a very great band called Joy Division who were
From Manchester?
From Manchester, a great band, and their singer Ian Curtis committed suicide
At the age of 19.
Yeah, very young. But their producer was a great guy called Martin Hannett. He produced the first U2 single, and was going to do the album, and basically decided not to produce the U2 album when Ian Curtis committed suicide. So U2 went back to their list of producers and went, Steve Lillywhite, he's number 2 on our list. So thank you, Ian Curtis, for committing suicide. I'm joking.
So, how did that actually transpire? You were second on their list. Did you get approached by Ireland or by Paul McGuinness? Did you go and meet the band?
I was approached by Ireland, and I flew to Ireland to go and see the band play. And I
And they're
remember
playing in
this.
Cork, which is Southern Ireland, right?
Southern Ireland, west of Ireland, and it's and I flew in, and I was told I would be met by a Mr. McGuinness, who and in those days Ireland was very colloquial and stuff, and I thought, oh my God, this man's going to have straw in his hair and pick me up on a tractor.
Because of something out in the countryside,
Yes,
you're going
exactly.
into the middle of nowhere to see the band?
Yeah, but there I arrive at the airport and it says, "Hello, Steve, Paul McGuinness here," and I went, "Oh, this is a man." And so there's this 40-minute drive to the gig from the airport, during which time he plays me the most appalling sounding demos you have ever heard
By the band?
by the band U2. But God bless Paul, he's a wonderful man. He had no idea. He didn't even think these sounded bad. It was like, this band are great, listen to this. And it was so bad, but he hadn't, it wasn't in his head to even question his artist. And this is what I love about him as a manager. It's
Brilliant
like,
manager.
a brilliant manager. And it took him 20 years before he even thought about managing someone else. So
'Cause he was on the Music Matters stage here a couple of years ago.
Oh, yes.
And certainly in the 32 years he's been managing the band, he's really done wonders. But
Yeah.
in the car, you think to yourself, I've come all the way to Ireland, I've heard this music, really doesn't sound all that
No.
good. What the hell am I getting myself into?
Yes, but you know, at this point, I was the guy who was the hot producer. I'd had hits, and but I went to see the band play, and it was much smaller than in here. I mean, it's a tiny little school hall, and I remember this: the moment the band came on stage, all the boys parted to one side, and all the girls parted to the other side. It's a very Catholic country, and and the band came on, and they were good, I have to say, and they had a passion on stage that was just, it was undeniable to me, you know. And then I went to meet them afterwards, and it was like, I don't know if anyone here has got 17-year-old kids, but they were just no personality whatsoever.
No personality from those guys.
Yeah, exactly. This is Bono, who has basically turned into his father now. You know, but it's what's great about them is that normally, I mean, bands are normally carefree before they become successful, and then the more they become successful, the more like the world sits on them, and they get worried more, right? You know, that's what happens with bands, and when people get money, there's the problems of the world. With U2, it's the opposite. In the early days, they were very problems of the world on their shoulders, and then as they got older, it's like, hey, we like this life, you know. So it worked the opposite for them.
That's when you made the first album, and
Yes.
that first album was Boy.
I think it was called Boy.
And when you were in the studio with them, was this when you started thinking about trying to refashion
Yeah, well,
the
this
Edge's
is-
guitar feel and sound with a much bigger kind of feel?
Well, this was in Ireland in 1980, which basically their music scene was all traditional Irish music. So so everything in the studio was very dead and not a great sound. So I walked around the studio looking for, you know, I mean, this is, you know, it's a typical thing a producer does, but he, you know, forever doing this. Nowhere sounded any good in the studio. Where can I put the drums? So to get to the studio, you had to walk through the reception area of the studio, which also Wimble Lane had a video upstairs had a video facility, downstairs was the recording studio, and when I walked through the reception area where the girl on the desk sat, it was fantastic. I clapped my hands. He went, it was great, and I said, we've got to record the drums out here. And the guys in the studio looked at me like, but that's where the girl sits to answer the phones. So I said, well, we'll do the drums at night then. So at 6 o'clock, the girl left the studio. We set the drums up out there. The phones would ring all the time, and it was like, who cares? No one's going to take a record back and say, I don't want this record because the phone's ringing on it. I see things like that as a blessing. You know, those are things from God that make you go, yes. Because when people hear a phone ringing on the record, once I tried to put a dog whistle on a record, because I thought, track 5, everyone starts running around because the fucking dog's... Why is the dog barking every time on track 5? It's still... I actually went all this way of recording the dog whistle onto tape, and then I took it to the mastering engineer, and he said that the frequency of the dog whistle, you couldn't get onto vinyl. But now I should do that because, of course, there's no vinyl. I haven't remembered. I've forgotten that for all these years.
So,
Sorry about that.
so you make the album,
Yes.
and the album makes its mark because the album gets into the chart.
It does
In the
okay.
UK, but okay,
It's-
not great.
No, it's one of those things where, you know, again, this is Paul McGuinness's world domination plan. Was, you know, it was like England and Ireland are good, but America is where the historical rock and roll, you know, Americans invented rock and roll, so therefore Americans, you know, if you invent something, you're serious about it. You know, and Americans are serious about their rock and roll, they're serious about their lyrics. You know, sometimes in Europe and everywhere else, it's like sort of not as serious. Americans are very serious about music. You know, they feel like it's something they invented.
But what that...
But anyway, they toured in America a lot, and
But what that U2 album did was, it got someone else to notice what you had done, namely Peter Gabriel.
Peter Gabriel, yep. Although Peter Gabriel had heard this band XTC that I'd produced and also liked them. But yeah, Peter Gabriel it was up until that point with the U2 and the Psychedelic Furs and XTC and all these other punk things I'd done, they were quick records, probably 6 weeks, 2 weeks recording, 2 weeks mixing, overdubbing, 2 weeks mixing. And then Peter Gabriel asked me to do an album, and this is a guy who was in a band called Genesis, and he left, and it was one of the few things where, you know, a singer leaves a band and the band become even bigger.
Bigger, yes.
You know, with Phil Collins. But he came from the era that we all hated, which was, you know, punk rock. 1977 was very much like that point for me, and Peter had made, you know, these progressive rock albums from before. But I met with him, and we really got on, and it was good. He was older than me as well, which, you know, I was always the same.
Was
age.
he looking for your punk energy to infuse his music?
Yeah, he was looking for someone who wasn't complacent. You know, I mean, for me, it doesn't matter if you're good or bad or however you are. That's just what it is. But complacency is just the worst thing. Mm-hmm. You know, my job is fucking important. I have to look after someone's whole career. If I'm sitting around thinking I'm Steve Lillywhite and everything's fine, that is complacent. You know, and I cannot stand that in anyone. Mm-hmm. Any attitude like that is just beyond it for me. Mm-hmm. You know, so complacency is bad. So, and Peter wanted someone who would push him and push the sonic barriers. And he said to me, I don't want any cymbals on the record.
What?
And this was, you know, so, because he didn't, you know, sometimes in putting just simple rules out like that is, can be very good, because you have to find ways of making it sound good without, you know, it's like with one arm, how do I work? You know, actually you can probably find this one arm works even better, you know. So we...
Did he want to get a big drum sound?
He didn't even think like that. All he thought was, I don't want cymbals. Now, I had previously been experimenting with... I've always looked at sound, not left and right. I look at sound in 3D.
What do you mean by that?
I just see it going, you know, I don't see it left to right. I always see it going right to the back. It's just something I've always done. You know, so before the Peter Gabriel record, I would always like listen to this distance, like the singer's mic through the drums, and it sounded great, you know. And so I'd started using this big ambient sound on drums, and of course when Peter said he didn't want any cymbals, that really helps, because cymbals don't sound good mic'd from a long way away. But drums do sound good. So I also at that time would overdub cymbals with you know, to get my perspectives, and it's boring, but you know.
No, but these are the way you construct sonic textures.
Well, that's what it is, yeah.
Architecturing the feel and the sound of the record.
Yeah, that's how I see, you know, even if it sounds just like a band playing live, it's not, you know, because you build it up step by step. And, you know, it's like a movie that you think's in real time, but it's, you know, it's not.
But that album also gave you your first top 5 record, number 4. You had a number 4 hit.
That's right.
With Games Without Frontiers.
That's right, I did.
Which was a Peter Gabriel hit.
Peter Gabriel hit. The album also was a, you know, a bit of a sonic landmark, and got great reviews. And I think it put me in this place that was, you know, oh, this guy doesn't just do punk rock. He's, you know, so... And I'd worked with like Joan Armour Trading at the same time, who's again
British
very
artist.
different, British sort of folk singer.
So was did this then go into the Simple Minds period?
Yeah, and then
another Scottish band called Big Country, where this big sound
yeah.
was something that then really came into its own.
Yeah, then I became known as the guy who did the big rock sound. And
so with Simple Minds, for example, did you go in to try and create this big sound behind Jim Kerr's beautiful voice?
Yeah, it just felt it was what I did at the time. I mean, it's very weird to say. I'm now looking back and analysing. Hey, Steve Lillywhite, what did he do? I go, oh, that's me. Yes, but nothing. really planned. I mean, I just, you take it one step at a time, and there was this era, when I was by the third U2 album. I mean, I had this nice little patch where there was, some big sounding rock records.
So really, what you were doing is you were meshing the kind of spirit and the energy and the anger of punk with a big rock sound, and effectively you'd kind of created a whole new sonic signature.
I did, and that probably culminated with the Rolling Stones. Oh, I know what I can do, and a lot of very, very big bands have approached me, and if I say I don't want to produce you, don't push it, because I know what I can do and what I can't. But if I come to you and say I want to produce you, I would have me, because, I would, honestly, I mean, but if I say no, there's a reason why I say no, and it's nothing to do with sales, it's to do with what I feel I can bring to your art. But on the first album, Larry's the drummer of U2, who is still a very handsome man.
Very handsome.
His dad used to come and pick him up at the end of the studio because he was only 17. It was like, what are you doing there, recording? And because he didn't know, he couldn't get home. His dad used to come and pick him up from the studio.
The Lars, that was one of your favorite bands to
I've
work
done
with.
more interviews about the Lars than pretty much anything else.
Do you think they were really an influential band?
He was one of the
15 years?
best artists I've ever worked with, but he was mad. No, but great. Mad is good.
No, Mad is good.
We love Mad.
We like good crazy people.
Yes.
Of course we do. So that's just
that.
there you go. There's a good crazy person.
Yes, that crazy person.
Okay, so the Dave Matthews Band.
Yeah.
Tell us first of all, with Dave Matthews, this was an interesting band, an American.
Yeah.
Actually, he
He's
was originally
South
from
African.
Africa.
Yep.
Moves to America, and Dave Matthews.
He's an African American.
He's an African American. He is indeed. Dave Matthews was someone who really believed that he should have musicians that could be incredible players, really great instrumentalists, great players, right?
Yeah, he was a barman at a bar in Charlottesville, and in fact, in Virginia, and his band are thought of as being very good, but in fact they were just the pickup band at the bar. So even though they are fantastic musicians, they hadn't got great breaks, and they were just playing at this bar. So when it's very funny because I'd been known, what I said earlier about no bending notes and nothing, certainly no drum solos. And all of a sudden, I hear this music, Dave Matthews Band, who, to be honest, it has been described as an acoustic guitar and a drum solo. And I just fell in love with it. And the general wisdom was, they'll never be big. Because where's the hooks, where's this and that? But for me, it's not about that. For me, I just heard it and went, that moves me in such a great way. I have to produce this band. So I flew to America.
When you say it moved, do you mean emotionally, creatively, texturally?
Everything about it.
So
I saw it. It was so clear to me. But they had... I was living in London. By the time I got sent the CD, they'd already decided on another producer. Oh. So I had to say no. I just knew this. I said, I have to go and produce this band. And in fact, the other producer was a guy who I knew, who is a good friend of mine, and but I said, he's wrong for you. I was just very sure.
You wanted to produce
so I flew to America myself, went to go and see the band, and this other guy... I won't say his name, he was at the show and we hung out and I said, look, you may want to produce this band. You may already think you are producing this band, but I'm sorry, I've got to do this. And we went out and I just, I can be quite forceful. And I went and basically press gang Dave into saying, look, you have to have me produce. I'm the man for you. And
what did he say?
He was a bit shell-shocked. But the A&R guy, who was a good friend, he said, yeah, I think you're right, and that started a really good journey. You see, what I love doing with band, when I was young and I used to buy the Beatles records, what was great about it was every time they had a new song out, it was like, I was so excited because it sounded different. Every one sounded different, And I like doing that with my artists. When I do more than one album, I really try and make sure that we take the fan on a journey. So, like with Dave Matthews, it was acoustic guitar on the first album, that's all. But then I got to do a second album, and I electrified the acoustics. I wanted to make sure that it was different, and we made it more muscly. Just like taking the fan on a journey.
So you make 3 albums with the Dave Matthews Band.
20 million albums sold. I mean, crazy.
20 million albums.
Yeah, more than that, actually.
More than that.
Yeah. And we come to do the 4th album.
And that's when things didn't go as well as you had hoped.
Well, this is when the band are suddenly rich. They build their own recording studio in their hometown. Now, at this point, U2 also had their own recording studio in their hometown.
Yeah.
And that becomes a very psychological difference. One, you're making a record. The other way is you're going to work, you see. Because when you go away from your hometown, which we've done on all the previous 3 Dave Matthews albums, you're going away to make a record. When you have a studio in your hometown, you're not going anywhere. You're going to work. And of course, everyone complains about work, as you should. So there's a big psychological difference. And I said, be careful, guys, you're going to work. This isn't making a record now. Psychologically, you're going to think of this as going to work. You're not going to think of this as making a record. And they went, no, Steve, it'll be great. So anyway, it took longer than we thought, and I knew that this was going to happen, right? So in June, the album was supposed to come out in time for their tour in the summer. We didn't finish in time. I made one morning at the end, we said, right, we're going to come back in September to finish the album. It's about 70% done. The band were going to go on tour for the summer. So I did some quick rough mixes on my own, made 5 CDs, one for each of the band, 6, one for each of the band, one for me. Said goodbye for the summer. Boom, there we go. Halfway through the summer, I get a call from the manager saying, Steve, you're out.
You're out, just like that.
Just like that, you're out. The record company thinks the album's too dark, and Dave is going to go in with a man called Glenn Ballard who
produced the Alanis Morissette album.
Morissette. Anyway, admittedly, Dave had been quite difficult in. He didn't find it easy to write the songs. But anyway, he then co-wrote a load of songs with Glenn Ballard, and one was constipation, one was diarrhea. I think they're both bad. And you just I recommend Bran. So anyway, this album that he made with Glenn Ballard got released. And on the day of the release of this album, my rough mixes got leaked onto Napster. Now, this was as Napster was just really blowing up. And my record was known as the Lillywhite Sessions.
Right.
So
These are the rough mixes you did?
These are the rough mixes I did. Now, these spread like wildfire. I think it's still officially the most downloaded album of all time, illegally downloaded. Well, it wasn't illegal. It was It was
really in that grey period in the early days of Napster.
Yeah. But no one knew who leaked it. But the fact is, my rough mixes were eaten up by the band. And one thing I've learned from here about, fans love, it's almost like that they love added content. They love to know more about the artist. And just because these were, they had count-ins in and stuff like that, they loved it. And one thing I learned about China this morning, it's like they won't buy the music, but they'll buy the extra stuff. It's, And this was
But you must have felt pretty lousy just to be basically dumped.
Well, I did, especially, I felt like I should have been given more time to realize my vision. But, the album got better, my rough mixes got better reviews. I've seen 5 or 6 different versions of artwork for the Lillywhite Sessions.
So, around about this period, you go through another epiphany. You're approached by Lucian Grange, who's now the global head of Universal Music, inviting you to become the managing director of Mercury Records.
The fool. Yes.
He hired you to run a record label.
To me to run a record label. Who would have thought? Yes, so
you hadn't done that before?
No. And it was very strange. I have only, and had at that point, only really related and and reacted to artists in my time, you know, and the odd tech guy at a studio, but to come in contact with accountants and people like that, it was strange.
But during that period, you signed a great band called Razorlight.
Yes, I did, and also signed some shit as well. But you know, people don't say that.
No, of course.
But no.
And then.
But yes, I did sign a band called Razorlight, so it wasn't all bad.
And then 2-3 years later, you joined Columbia Records in the States.
I did.
And you were...
Yeah, I was a senior vice president of A&R there, which was great.
And then you spotted and found the band MGMT.
Yep.
Now,
So
Steve,
they're another good band.
How did you develop this knack for being able to identify talent? Because that clearly has been something that's been consistent with you. Have you... Going to see gigs, you said you were the guy that went to all the gigs, hearing the band, hearing you two in those early days in the school hall.
Yeah.
What is it that gives you that radar?
Damn, I wish I could find it, bottle it, and sell it. Wouldn't that be good? You'd buy it, right?
We'd give each one someone to take home with them tonight.
Free sample of Steve Lillywhite's special potion. I don't know. I use my heart. And
But how do you know how to anticipate that might be the next trend, the next hit, is this just an instinctual thing?
I think it's instinctual. I mean, I obviously have studio chops, and I think my personality is conducive to my job. You know, I think I'm very good at making artists feel comfortable, and I never let them see me worried, because I think it's very important that say if something goes wrong technically with the studio. You know, there are some producers who maybe go, you know, say, that machine's not lined up, like this, you know. Whereas I would never do that, because I just see it that an artist, if the moment an artist looks at me and thinks, Steve is worried, they are not able to do what they do in a great way. So, I always make sure that the artist is feeling good about what they do, and, you know.
I saw you last night at Clark Key.
Really?
Looking at bands and watching bands. This is something that's now... You just love hearing interesting new sounds.
I do. Well, yes. And it's funny. The one thing I find boring now is two guitars, bass, and drums. And I think the public do.
Well,
to be honest,
you certainly were exposed to many different artists, as we saw in that list.
Yeah.
But there was another very big name that you got to produce,
right?
Who Elton John kind of turned you onto, which was the Rolling Stones.
Tell
us a little bit about that.
Okay, so anyway, anyone heard of the Rolling Stones? Yes, of course you have. A real man wouldn't turn down the Rolling Stones, and I think of myself as a real man, Ralph. But the fact is, I knew from the moment I walked into that room that basically this was 1986, 1987. Mick Jagger had just released his first solo album that was affectionately known amongst everyone as that fucking disco album.
A quaint title.
It's called She's the Boss or something. But, you know, but Keith, you know, Keith Richards is a beautiful man, but for him, he's very much like, you're only in one band, and if you know, anything else, you're being unfaithful to that band. And, you know, subsequently, Keith has made by far the coolest solo album of the Rolling Stones, Talk Is Cheap. But at that point, Keith hadn't made a solo record.
What was that experience like working with those guys who made so many albums before? What was your job?
I wear many hats in the studio. One of them is Henry Kissinger. And during this album...
Rockin' Henry.
I would have Mick Jagger going, ring, 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 go and tell him that. And I'd have to go to Keith and go, well, he says, well, you tell him this. And, you know, they hardly spent any time in the studio together.
So it wasn't really such a satisfying project.
It was. I learnt, though, that they didn't learn so much from me. I learned more from them. I did learn, because occasionally I just got this little glimpse of how a great band operated, you know. And I did occasionally, there was a song called Harlem Shuffle, which was actually a pretty big hit off that album.
It was a big hit.
And they just clicked. Just imagine cogs, you know. It's like if they're not all aligned, nothing works. But then all of a sudden it just goes click, and then this whole, you know, and that's how the Rolling Stones worked. You know, 99% of the time, it was the worst pub band you'd have ever heard. And then there's this little magical thing happens, and ooh.
And that
my
incredible
job
sound,
was to capture that magical thing.
and that incredible sound that Keith Richards just gets naturally out of the guitar.
Oh yeah, he's well that 5-string tuning was just two notes and stuff, so you just go like that.
Really?
It's great, yeah.
So let's take a more serious look at you two. Let's just pull up this slide if we can, please, Ed, and just take a look at the discography that we have here of you two, particularly because I thought we could go into some interesting ideas. We've got the red slide. There we are. That's the one we want. So if we just have a look.
Oh, by the way, I was going to say, I thought I'd worked on 8 U2 albums, and I only see 7 there. And
I think you did. We might not have included that.
All That You Can't Leave Behind,
All That You
which
Can't Leave Behind.
only with Beautiful Bloody Day on it. Thanks, Ralph.
No. I was going to come to that.
A separate
so
one. Yeah.
we spoke about Boy, October, and War.
Yeah.
Then comes the Joshua Tree.
Okay, this is what happened, really. I'd produced the first 3 albums, and it's funny, I told you earlier I was very opinionated. I also felt in my sort of strangely moral way that I could work with lots of different bands. So why shouldn't bands work with lots of different producers? Because it was only fair. So I would only say, I'll only do 1 album with you. I won't do a second one. Now, after Boy, they said, Steve, and I said, oh, all right then. So I did October, but October was not as successful as Boy. So at the end of October, I said, look, I'm really, that's it. And they said, yeah, you're right. We'll find someone else. So they went and did some recording with some other people, and randomly Sandy Pearlman. Do you remember him? Blue Oyster Cult? And they didn't like the results. So they, what's that extra 10 minutes, please?
No, don't worry about that.
So anyway, so they asked me back for War. But after War, they, we got to this point. They'd had hits, and it was great. Then they went on Unforgettable Fire, worked with Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno, and had, hits. And then came the Joshua Tree. And
let's have a picture of the album, the Joshua Tree. I think they've got something up there.
18 months into making the Joshua Tree, Paul McGuinness, who is, just black and white, it's like, guys, you've done well, but you haven't done that well. You've spent 18 months on this album, and it's still not out. So those albums you made with Steve, though, they only took 6 weeks. Why? And they went, oh yeah. Well, and Paul said, why don't you get Steve in to come and help you finish it off? So my job at that point then became this guy who comes in to finish, because, and I love Brian Eno and I love Daniel Lanois and obviously love the band, but they sometimes have a problem finishing things. So my job was to come in and go, okay, let's finish it. So they gave me like what they thought were the singles, so With or Without You, and I remember,
Without You, my God, what a
I
great
remember
song.
doing a version of With or Without You and going to playing it to Paul, and Paul said, thank goodness, this is the first time anything sounded like a record in 18 months. So, it was very
But
nice
that
of
was
him to say
a
that.
classic, Joe.
Yeah,
Incredible
yeah.
song.
It's a great song, and we knew we had a great album. But my job then became the finisher. So I did that, an Achtung Baby, and then the singles really.
And of course, Beautiful Day was before Joshua Tree or after Joshua Tree.
So far after
Far
Joshua
after.
Tree.
Okay,
Yes.
but so just to get back into the chronology,
Yeah.
You were involved with making Beautiful Day.
Beautiful Day. I remember. I think one of the better U2 songs, but I remember my wife at the time. They gave me a cassette, and I wish I had this version of the song. And I came home and I played it to her, and I said, "This is what they want as a single." And she went, "Really? That's not very good, is it?" And I wish I still had that, because I would love to be able to, give you a like before and after, but yeah, Beautiful Day turned out really good, and I kicked them into action.
Grammys, great
Yeah, we got
awards for you on
Grammys,
that.
everything. Yeah, it was really good.
Let's pull up the album cover for How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb, because that
Yeah.
was also
well,
another.
my job on this album was a bit different, because up and with the Joshua Tree and Achtung Baby and All That You Can't Leave Behind, I joined the team that was there. On How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb, they were probably at their lowest point I'd ever seen them. And because they had to fire a producer. They'd gone 18 months recording, and it wasn't very good. And it was adequate. The thing about U2 that makes them great, you can listen to Beautiful Day and you can analyze it, and you still go, well, what makes it so good? Because all he's singing is "It's a Beautiful Day." You know, basically what I'm saying is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's what makes U2 great. It's that sort of X factor thing.
But you helped shape the guitar sound. You helped really give them reinforce their sonic identity.
Of course. But on this album, they, so I took over and pretty much produced, and brought it back up. And
that Vertigo is such a great rock piece that got you onto the
stage.
Oh yeah,
well, you see, the way Edge plays guitar is it's normally all with the delays and single note delays. But so it's very rare that he see, people think of U2 as a rock band. They're not as rocky. They're not live. They're a rock band, but it's as gospel as it is rock.
Great songwriters.
Because but with Vertigo, it was a rock riff because Edge doesn't normally play bar chords. So and this was a fantastic riff of Edge's,
But that album got them 9 Grammy Awards.
And it got me Producer of the Year. Ralph.
Got you Producer of the Year. Fantastic achievement to get a Producer of the Year from the Grammys. Amazing. So let's go to the next album jacket, which you'll recognize, which was another album that you worked with the band on. But also, what we're going to do as we're pulling this up, we have a special surprise for you tonight, Steve, because I made contact with U2 yesterday, and I wanted to ask them what they thought of working with you. So we got this tape flown over to us overnight. In fact, it was sent to us. We managed to download it this afternoon. So can we go to that video clip? And I just hope that we'll be able to get away with this. We might be winging it, but what the hell? It's rock and roll. Big surprise.
Got it.
Shot yesterday.
Well, what did Steve bring to the studio that produced some great results for us? Steve brought a great musicality. From the rhythm section's point of view, he introduced us to the click track, which is pretty standard these days, but it forced Larry and myself to play in time, which was a sort of minor aspiration at the time. But that was good. And also in those early recordings, he encouraged me to do bass overdubs on top of what was already there. And I think on the early records, that kind of created an unusual depth and sound, particularly to the Boy record. Well, he he always encouraged us. I mean, Steve was always great because whatever we wanted or whatever we heard, he would always, let us pursue that. And he would change, whatever he was doing to suit what we wanted. It wasn't the case of him just coming in and putting a sound over us. Well, he was a very musical producer. I mean, he's a bass player. And as I say, Steve would always kind of pursue whatever our vision was. I mean, if it meant going back in and remixing something or re-recording something because we didn't like the sound, he never complained. He would always work that extra hour. Well, for us, we made our first record with him when we were like 20 years of age, and he was like the older brother. I think he was 25 or 26. So he was like the grown-up, and we made sure that he was the responsible parent. He was in charge.
That's fantastic. Just give a big round of applause.
Actually,
that's incredible. That's nice, isn't it?
Oh, that's wonderful. Actually, it just reminded me of a really funny story. I remember being on that first album and sitting at the mixing desk, and the band were behind me on the couch. And I would hear this giggling, and I turned round, And they go, like that. And it's funny because they really thought of me as like the school teacher then. Because, I mean, 5 years is not very much of an age difference now. But, you know, when they were 20, well, and actually Adam's the oldest, and he was 20. Edge was 18, I think, and Larry was 17. And I was 25. And, you know, I was like the grown-up. And I think they still see me a little bit like those were their formative years. So they, you know, whenever they see me again, it's like, oh, we better go to work now because Steve's here, you know.
So, Steve, we're running a little bit short of time, but I thought what we could do is the most recent stuff you've been doing actually has taken place on Broadway because you've been involved in Spider-Man, the musical, that music written by Edge and Bono, and you're going to be producing the cast album, and you were in New York the last couple of weeks?
Oh, I literally, on Monday of this week, I took my suitcase to the studio, I finished the last mix, and I got the plane here.
To Singapore.
To Singapore, and with the wonderful technology now, is that Bono and Edge and the guy who plays Peter Parker in the Broadway production sung the first single on American Idol last night. And it's now in the charts on iTunes already.
So this means that this Broadway musical, which cost $65 million to produce on Broadway, your music is now going to be
and the single's already for sale, and the album I think is the physical is on the 14th of June. It's you know, and I think digitally it's coming out a week earlier than that.
You know, we could go on talking like this for another couple of hours, hearing these war stories, these great stories, musical stories, song stories, lyric stories. Steve, you've had an incredible career, and it's just such a privilege.
I hope to still have another bloody career.
You will? Yeah, this is just the start. You're going to China. Here's something for Scarlett Lee and her friends from China. Steve, we've got to try and find a great way of getting someone from Asia, Indonesia. You saw with Sandy last night.
I love Sandy's voice.
Great voice. But someone from China needs your expertise to try and bring them.
I think I've got something to give. Yeah, I would love
someone from Japan, someone from Malaysia, Asia. We need you here.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, Steve Lillywhite.
Thank you very much.